Today, we're going to answer some of your burning questions about personal finance and how to apply it in a world that is tough today on men.
How do I handle the pressure of being the provider without burning out?
I think this is really interesting because you have to begin with the end in mind. It's really important to know what you and your spouse have agreed to in the first place so that you know whether or not you can do that consistently over time without burning out and come to a unified standard of what life should look like. Because oftentimes people will go ahead and overburden themselves, not with needs, but with wants. And once the wants go ahead and stack up too high, it makes it so that your minimum acceptable threshold for life keeps sliding up with it.
Should I pay for all dates or is it okay to split the bill?
So here's the thing, it really depends on how you want to be perceived. My advice would be that I'm going to pay for all the dates. And the reason why is that it starts with establishing the frame. If I want to go ahead and establish a frame for the relationship, I want to make sure that I'm putting my best foot forward. And so it's easy for her to go ahead and step into a feminine role. By paying for the dates, that's one major step that goes ahead and allows her to relax into the feminine. Because a lot of times when people talk about going Dutch or people talk about 50-50 arrangements, it really goes ahead and sets a woman into a different frame of mind. And honestly, if you can't pay for the dates, then maybe you should be working on other things first so that you can handle it. Now, here's another thing is maybe you're trying to do too much all at once. Whereas I would recommend that you go ahead and start small and escalate over time. If you guys have been together for a while, things will go ahead and look different. That's just a fact of life.
What if I can't afford to be the breadwinner my partner expects?
Well, if you're not meeting her expectations, then chances are you're going to have fundamental issues in your relationship to begin with. If you can't afford to be the breadwinner right now, but you can be along the way, determine whether that makes sense for you. In my case, I was willing to go ahead and put myself on the line to make it work, but we came to an agreement early on in our relationship of what that entails and what that looks like. And we focused on needs and not on wants. So that made it really easy to start being the breadwinner and for us to gradually get a better life over time.
How do I maintain my masculine identity when I'm struggling financially?
Ooh, I think both of those are linked intrinsically, because usually if you're struggling financially, it's a sign that you don't have competencies that the marketplace values. And usually masculinity is very connected to competence and confidence. And if you don't have either of those two, I would start there by getting to be really good at something that the market values so that you can not be struggling financially. If it's a matter of debt and monetary management, I would go ahead and start there with managing your money properly first, then working from there.
How much should I spend on dates without going broke?
This is a really personal question. From my opinion, I think that you shouldn't spend more than 5% of your take-home pay on dates. What that looks like is going to mean different things depending on how much income you bring home. And I think that it's important to order your life that way so that you could think about things to keep things in focus.
When should we combine finances versus keep them separate?
Well, this is a good one. I think this really depends on what your goals are in life. I think that it is really important to know where you are and where you want to be. For example, it's really important to go into the marriage with separate finances so that if things go awry, your interests are taken care of and she is only entitled to the things that you had done together in the marriage. If you're a normal Joe and you're making average income, I think this is less of a concern. And this is a matter of whether or not she is responsible with finances and whether you're responsible with finances. If you're both responsible, you can combine them so long as you're on the same page of how to work it. In my family, early on in our marriage, things happened to the point where I went ahead and had a separate bank account that all my stuff went into. And I would go ahead and give her a little bit from that on a biweekly basis so that she can handle her minor, needs and little spending stuff. And I can handle business.
How do I talk about money with my partner without seeming cheap?
Well, that's interesting. I think it just depends on how you approach it. The big thing is if you want to build a life together, This is a topic that has to naturally come up because finances are one of the biggest things that causes divorces and causes breakups. If you are not aligned on money, it's important to recognize that early and maybe either find alignment or separate. Now, the fact that you're bringing up the topic of money in the first place shouldn't be about whether you're cheap or whether you are willing to spend everything. The real question is whether you have alignment. That's the biggest thing, is focus on building a team with your partner. If that's super important to you and you're looking towards marriage or you're already married, you've got to figure these things out because otherwise it'll tear your family apart.
Should I date someone who makes more money than me?
Generally speaking, I would advise against this. You could, it depends on whether you have a plan to go ahead and make more money over time. But I think that generally speaking, marriages are a lot happier when the man makes a little bit more than the woman or makes substantially more. I think that the times that are most risky for guys is when you are 50-50 and she makes the promotion and you don't. That is the number one indicator of divorce in that circumstance, is whether when you guys were on the level and she is above you now. So take a look at what your goals are together. If she makes substantially more and you don't have a pathway to get there, think about how that dynamic is going to work out over time. Generally speaking, it is better for the man to make more than the woman because it's easier for her to fall under your frame for that reason.
How do I handle financial expectations from women I'm dating?
Ooh, okay. This is an interesting one because a lot of times expectations are not expressed verbally, but they are expressed through her actions and her attitudes. So I think it's important that if you find any kind of attitude changes, depending on how you are handling finances, that you address them sooner rather than later so that things can be out in the open. I think one of the worst things you can do is see an item of disrespect because of a financial reason and not go and address it properly, because otherwise it'll fester and it'll cause you problems long term.
How do I invest and build wealth in my 20s and 30s?
I think the first step to this is making sure that you're on a budget and that your income exceeds your expenses. If you don't have that, you can't build wealth to begin with. So once you have that in place, what I would do is, when you're at a point where you can live on about 80% of what you bring in, go ahead and at least put 10% to savings up until the point where you have 6 months of expenses saved up, and then lean hard into investing.
Should I prioritize career advancement or work-life balance?
Ooh, that's a personal question, right? You have to go ahead and understand where your values lie. If career advancement will be that next level of self-actualization for you, and you can deal with the grind over the extended period of time to achieve that. Now, this is assuming that it's a zero-sum game, and in order for you to advance career, you have to give up work-life balance. Ideally, you don't, but that's a matter of what your priorities are, and that's a personal thing. Now, work-life balance, I think, is really important, but it's difficult to do that if you're not able to live in the first place. So if you can't live on 80% of what you make, for example, I would definitely prioritize career advancement and increasing income over work-life balance, because here's the thing. There is no life if you cannot live on what you make in the first place.
How do I start investing with limited income?
Okay, so if your income is limited, the big thing is to figure out what you absolutely need to live on and where that jives with what you're making. I would be remiss to say that if you are not really making it, you really shouldn't be investing. I would go ahead and focus on getting skills, abilities, and relationships to help you to make more income, to make a gap with which to invest.
What's the minimum income needed to be financially stable for dating?
That's a great question. So if you have 10% of your take home pay that's going into savings and another 10% that's going into investments, and you still have about 5 or 10% of your take home pay that you don't need to live life and all of that, I think that's probably the right time to go ahead and start looking to date, is when you have all those check boxes in. 10% going to investments, 10% going to savings, and you still have 10% of room. So a 10-10-10 rule.
How do I build multiple income streams while working full time?
Ooh. So this depends on a lot of things. Like if you want to have a side hustle, I would say that that's something to work on while you're working full time. Something that I did was I was buying real estate and I was renovating houses so that I can rent them out and then refinancing uh, my renovation budget out of it after I was done and got a renter in there. And real estate has been really good for me and my family. Something that it could look like for you is maybe delivering pizza could go ahead and start, building you towards something else. That was something I did in my mid 20s so that I can go ahead and get more room. Another thing that you might want to look at is things like Fiverr is find gigs that make sense with what skills you want to build over time, because you might be surprised that those things that you do on the side may end up bringing in a disproportionate amount of your income later on and could replace your full time job. For example, the real estate that I was doing on the side is now by far where most of my money is made at this point.
How do I stop tying my self worth to my bank account?
That's interesting. That's a personal thing. Like, first of all, we're talking about personal finance to begin with. I think that you may need to go ahead and talk to somebody about that, but it seems like you're using your bank account as a measure of your value as a person. Your bank account is the reflection of your habits over time. Like, for example, if you go ahead and bring in a certain amount of money and you spend that same amount of money, your bank account doesn't change. It reflects your behavior. So, one thing to do is you could go ahead and tie it to your bank account and change your actions to influence the outcomes you see. In that way, maybe tying your self worth to your bank account is a positive thing as an impetus for change. If you want to completely decouple it, I think that it's important first to make sure that you can live on what you make. And if you can't, you're not really going to be able to do that, because every time you're struggling and your bank account reflects a negative balance or something close to zero, it's going to cause you anxiety and stress, regardless of what's going on. You're going to have to go through the mental hoops. And unless you build up the competencies that allow you that breathing room, this will always be a problem for you.
How do I handle the shame of not being where I should be financially?
This is an interesting one. I remember when I was growing up, a lot of my peers, um, once they hit their 20s, they immediately wanted to buy homes and cars that reflected their parents' reality rather than their own. And so as a result, they went ahead and burdened themselves with overwhelming amounts of debt, and that caused them financial strain and mental strain over time. So I would say that the first thing to do is to go ahead and figure out, where do you actually fit in on this hierarchy? Because it's totally possible that when you see somebody else do the thing, that maybe they're hurting themselves in order to get what you see on the outside for the sake of looking good for people that you don't care about. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you are behind the eight ball of what you think you should be at, then I would go ahead and take a look at building up a plan and working that plan. Because once you're taking action, you can take some of the stress off of not being where you should be, because you are taking actionable steps to be where you want to be. And at some point, the should be and the is will be the same. And in fact, if you go ahead and take this mentality, chances are you're going to be further ahead of where you should be. And this won't be a source of shame, but a source of pride.
When is it okay to ask for financial help without feeling weak?
Okay, so this is an interesting question, because there are times where you are putting in the work. You are working 80 hours a week and something happens. And stuff happens to all of us. If you don't already have an emergency fund and you genuinely are putting in your reps, you're putting in the hours, uh, it's really easy if you've got a good friend network to go ahead and ask at that point. Because if they can clearly see that you're putting in the work, it's really not going to be a symbol of shame for someone to give you a hand up when you've been knocked down. Just remember that down the road, if something happens to them, you want to make sure that you're in a position, if they're doing the work, to be able to extend a hand when they need help too.
How do I deal with financial comparison to other men?
Well, if you are the one doing the comparing, you have the ability to change that. If other people are making comparisons on you, you can't control that. Those are facts of life. Now, as far as dealing with it, if you are doing what you're supposed to be doing to reach the goals that you set out for yourself, that's going to be a matter of time and effort. And people judging you for where you're at now will look at you very differently 5 years from now when you've been working that plan. Because it is relatively rare for people to go ahead and set out to do something great and achieve it because they often lack the consistency to put a plan to motion and to execute. So I would say that the best thing to do is to determine where the comparison is coming from and to handle it appropriately based on where it is and where you want to be.
What do I do when financial stress is affecting my confidence?
All right. So, generally speaking, confidence comes from competence and getting the reps over time. If financial stress is affecting your confidence, chances are you are not making enough to live the way that you want to be living. So, first, I would identify whether or not you do make enough to meet your needs. If you don't, you probably need to find another job, find better skills, start a side hustle of some sort, or find a way to increase that income so that the expenses will be relatively smaller by comparison. When you do those things, your confidence will naturally improve over time because the more confidence you have, or the more competence you have, rather, the more confident you will feel in any line of endeavor, whether it's financial, whether it is physical, whether it is relationships. This principle applies across the board.
How do I budget for dating and social life?
Ooh. Okay, so one way to look at this is part of your entertainment budget. So in other questions, I had mentioned the 10-10-10 rule. And this is if you are able to save 10% of your take home, you're able to invest 10% of your take home, and you still have 10% left over that doesn't have to go to needs. That's probably a good way to look at it, is to make sure that no more than 10% of your take home is going to dating and social life. If you do want to go ahead and plan for some like extended trip, you want to go ahead and use some of your savings to pay for that.
Should I buy a house or keep renting in my 30s?
Ooh, that really depends on a couple of things. One, what your income is. Two, what the housing market looks like where you live. Three, whether or not you are willing to move in order to buy a house. Ah, those three things, if answered completely differently, will usually guide you to the principle. I would say that if you value autonomy and your ability to move and react to different circumstances, it does not make sense to buy a house because usually with normal appreciation, it takes 3 to 4 years in order for your house to appreciate enough to pay for compensation to a realtor to sell it once you've associated all your various costs of doing business. So if you want that flexibility, I would not buy a house at that point. If you are looking to lay down roots, I would make sure that no more than 25% of your take home income goes to mortgage, insurance, taxes, and maintenance. If you can go ahead and handle all of that under a quarter of your take home pay, it may be a good idea to go ahead and buy a house. But those two things are the big important deals is one, proportionality, whether it goes ahead and makes sense with the amount of income you're making relative to the costs that you will incur. And two, whether you value freedom or you value laying down roots. Those are the two really big topics that I would look at first before making that decision.
How much should I have saved for retirement?
Ooh, okay. Uh, let's see. I think the big thing is to look at the 4% rule. Whatever you think you need to live on by the time you retire, whenever that is going to be, whether it's retiring at 30 or whether you're going to retire at 65 or beyond that, the thing to look at is, can you live on 4% of your assets? So for example, if you have $1 million saved up in like the S&P 500 or something that has an average annual rate of return of 8%, if you can live on $40,000 a year, then a million is a really good benchmark for you. So that's the math, is I would go ahead and look at living on 4% or less of that nest egg, and that should go ahead and be the thing that informs how much that nest egg should be.
I have a follow up question to this.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that saving for retirement isn't savings account just to drain it until I'm dead?
No, that's ridiculous. Please don't do that. Like, uh, savings accounts historically do not keep up with inflation. And inflation is probably the biggest thing that's killing people in Gen Z and the millennial generations right now because they don't have assets. And so, because they don't have assets, as the value of things increase relative to cost and what they're worth, they are getting gutted as a result of it. So, no, I would not put your money just in savings as far as like long term retirement stuff. If you're talking about emergency saving, definitely keep that in something liquid like a savings account. But for your long term savings and long term retirement needs, I would go ahead and put it in an asset class that appreciates over time. And hopefully, it also goes ahead and adds income to you so that you can continue to reinvest that income and buy more assets with it.
How do I handle debt while trying to build wealth?
There's a couple of ways to look at this. One, you can go ahead and get rid of all of your debt so that you can swing a bigger bat at building wealth, or you can take a balanced approach. I prefer the balanced approach because I know that things that I invest in are bringing in at least 8% a year. So any debt that I have that's 4% or less doesn't go ahead and get additional income from me. Now, with that said, if you're an average guy and you're doing the average job thing, I would go ahead and focus on getting rid of debt. No matter what the interest rate is, go ahead and handle it from the lowest balance to the highest balance so that you get quick and easy wins along the way. And you can just snowball the payments once you've paid a thing off into the next thing, into the next thing, into the next thing. Once all the debt is paid off, now you have a lot more income that so long as your lifestyle doesn't creep up with that extra income, you can take all of that income and put it into wealth building endeavors.
What insurance do I actually need as a single man?
Ooh, as a single man, I would say that for every major asset you have, you want to have an insurance policy against it. So, for example, if you have a home or if you have a car, if you have loans on it, you're going to be required to carry insurance to protect the bank and their interests. But even if you have them paid off, I would carry insurance on them anyway, because what it does is it reduces your risk in the event of a catastrophic event. Now, other forms of insurance that I would carry. If I'm a renter, I would definitely carry renter's insurance. I would carry health insurance. If you have substantial like dental issues, you can go ahead and determine whether you want to self-insure for your cleanings and all of that, or if you want to buy dental insurance. And if you wear glasses, make a determination whether the cost of the vision insurance actually makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to do that. It just depends on what your actual needs are on that. As a single guy, if you have any obligations that come up, I would look into buying life insurance earlier in my life than I would later in life because the premiums that you would be expected to pay relative to the amount of insurance that you can keep is relatively low when you're young and healthy. So it would be a good idea to lock in like a 30-year level term life insurance policy when you're younger, if you are of the mind that you want to get married someday. Because when you can buy the most effective premiums or most effective policy with a low premium, it helps you along the way as you're building your wealth, and it gives you protection for you and your family if something bad were to happen. The way that I use life insurance is that in the event of my untimely demise, I have enough life insurance that it pays off major asset related debts. So, like on houses, apartment complexes, commercial strip centers, I have enough where it puts a substantial debt or dent into those debts where they're either paid off or they're paid down substantially. That way, my wife and children can enjoy the benefits of those assets without the encumbrance of that debt. Another thing that is really helpful with life insurance is that if things were to happen to my wife, I also have insurance policies on her because, hey, she contributes a lot to my life, and it would be a substantial burden on my life if she were to meet an untimely demise. And so I would need to go ahead and have some things to replace a lot of the tasks that she does inside the house and for taking care of the family that I would rather put an appropriate other person to handle those things rather than handling them myself. And that takes money.
The big question I have is, it seems like a lot of the anxiety and like comparison and stuff is just a signal to a man that he has changes he needs to make.
Dude, you are totally right on that. Like, usually, anxiety is a sense of our self telling us that we need to do better and we need to make changes. And oftentimes, the anxiety is a signal to look yourself in the mirror and see what's really getting you down and take an inventory of what you need to change. Financially speaking, most of it is about skills acquisition and disciplines. If you aren't making enough money to meet your basic needs, that's a skill issue usually. I'm not going ahead and using this as a joke. That's a genuine thing. You just do not have the skills that are valuable in the market to earn compensation enough to meet those needs. Secondly, if you have needs that are actually wants, you may be surprised with how little you actually need and how little you can actually spend to go ahead and eat and get 100 grams of protein in your body so you can have a minimum standard for actually living fairly well and start from there. Hey, this has been Q&A on personal finance and where it really relates to masculinity in a lot of ways, because I recognize that there's a lot of people in the younger generations that are struggling right now. At times, we have a fundamental disconnect between what we think we should have and what we actually have. Sometimes we think what should be rather than what is, and we fail to see that golden thread that connects the two, because a lot of times there are actions we need to take and disciplines we need to build so that we can get to where we want to be down the road. I encourage you that if this message has struck a chord with you, that you hit the subscribe button down below. And if this is useful to anybody in your circle, I encourage you to send it their way so they can benefit just like you do. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.